Most countries welcome tourism, whether from their own citizens or from those abroad. But every country will have areas that are only accessible to a select few. Sometimes these creepy, forbidden locations are places that need to be protected from the general public, or that the general public needs to be protected from. Other areas are much more secretive, and even what we know about the locations is very restricted. Number 5. Hidden in a mountain in the Mexican desert lies one of the most incredible sights on Earth, but it remains off limits to visitors, and even the scientists that studied the giant crystal cave can no longer visit. Sierra Nica is a mountain located in the desert of Chihuahua, Mexico. It lies precisely on a fault line that created the mountains millions of years ago. A magma chamber was pushed up through the fault line. It didn't breach the surface, but did push the land above it upwards. The magma chamber has since settled back down, but the landform remained. Mineral-rich water was pushed into the caverns and gaps in the rock. The heat from the magma chamber below kept the water at a high temperature, but eventually cooling began to take effect. In a horseshoe-shaped chamber 300 meters below the surface, this created something incredible. For hundreds of thousands of years, the water temperature remained at just under 58 degrees Celsius. It was low enough that crystals would dissolve in the water. They would often reform into selenite, a type of gypsum. Because the temperature was still close to the point where crystals began dissolving, the process was incredibly slow. The number of crystals that would be created was limited, but that meant those could grow to enormous sizes. The strange cavern remained hidden, even as humans discovered what was hidden elsewhere in the mountain. The anhydrite and gypsum weren't the only things pushed up by the swell of magma, though. In 1794, silver was discovered on the mountain. The Nica mine was developed and owned by the Pinoles Mining Company, and silver, gold, lead, and zinc were extracted from the mountain. For over 100 years, people worked at the mine before something beautiful was uncovered in 1910. At a depth of 120 meters below the surface, miners broke through to another cavern. It was roughly 104 meters long, and the walls were completely covered with crystals. These were only roughly a meter long and earned the space the name the Cave of Swords. Inside of the cave looked creepy, with countless shards of chalky white crystals jutting out and only a narrow space for people to walk through. Workers knew they had uncovered something special, and the cave was eventually opened up to tourists. That caused significant damage to the crystals and may have ruined the natural wonder for generations to come. For many years, going further into the mountain wasn't an option. It was stiflingly hot, and many of the caverns remained flooded by groundwater. The Pinoles Mining Company eventually decided to begin pumping water out of the lower parts of the mountain. A small artificial lake was created near the town of Nica, and the pumps drained roughly an Olympic swimming pool worth of water every 40 minutes. The pumps meant that miners could go deeper into the mountain, but the heat was still a major problem. In 2000, there were plans to add air conditioning to the lower levels of the mine, and two brothers began a new channel for the system. Pedro and Juan Sanchez broke through the horseshoe-shaped cave in the spring and uncovered something even more amazing than the Cave of Swords. Not only was this cave bigger, but the crystals had taken longer to grow. In the other cave, the crystals were a meter long. These were a meter wide and roughly 12 meters in length. Miners and later scientists were able to walk across some as if they were wooden rafter beams, while others jutted out at off angles from walls covered in a unique mixture of clay and iron oxides, stitched together by microbial filaments. It looked like nothing that had ever been seen on Earth before. Comparisons to another planet and Superman's Fortress of Solitude would both be fitting. Unfortunately, the giant crystal cave was about as hospitable as another planet. Scientists could only ever manage a few minutes at a time in the wondrous cavern before having to leave. Even with the water pumped out, temperatures were still more than 50 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was nearly 100%, increasing the temperature and making it extremely dangerous to remain in the cave. Staying long would lead to liquid condensing in an explorer's lungs, which would take their life. Scientists turned to those who explored volcanic caves for assistance, and special suits were created. Not only did these cool the scientists, but they also provided breathable air. Even in these special suits, research trips were limited to less than an hour as it was still incredibly hot. The inhospitable temperatures didn't stop everyone from trying to go into the cave, even without protection. At least one miner managed to sneak into the cave. He tried to use a bag of air to survive the terrible conditions and try to steal some of the crystals. He lost consciousness and his body was later found. It was clear that this wasn't a space that could be opened up to tourists. Even if they had proper protection, it would be easy for someone to get lost and not be found until it was too late. These were the largest natural crystals to ever have been found, and at first scientists had lots of questions about the site. Through experiments, it was discovered that it would take between 500,000 and 900,000 years for the crystals to have grown to the enormous size that they were. Dating them any further was difficult due to how pure they were. Usually, radioactive elements like uranium would be used to determine the lifespan, but there was no uranium to be found. Scientists also wanted to know if any life had survived in the crystals themselves. The structure of the crystal meant that there was a layer of water between layers of minerals, and it was discovered that microbes had survived dormant in the water for tens of thousands of years. They were also unique to anything else found on Earth. Learning more about this life could help us understand how life may have originated and how life may be found on other planets. Unfortunately, after 17 years, the cave was off limits once again. Today, the only way to look at the cave is through photos that were taken when it was open. In 2017, miners broke into an aquifer. More water poured into the lower levels of the Nika mine faster than the pumps could remove it. In the end, the lower tunnels, including the giant crystal cave, were allowed to flood. It prevented any thrill-seeking tourists from risking their lives to go into the cave, but also protected the crystals themselves. One day, the cave may be dried again for future generations to witness the amazing sight, but for now, the crystal cave is strictly off limits to everyone. Number 4. Russia's so-called closed cities have become relatively infamous. These cities and towns are closed off to the outside world, designed to keep secret the activities of whatever industry they were built to support. But Russia isn't the only country to have these closed cities. During the development of nuclear weapons and the Cold War, the United States also had a handful of these closed cities. While some have been abandoned or opened up after the activity there ended, the town of Mercury, Nevada is still officially off limits to anybody without special permission to visit. Mercury lies on Highway 95, 60 miles north of Las Vegas. Today, the turnoff to the small town is noted on road signs, but the fact that there are no services open to travelers usually puts off anybody who might think about making a pit stop in the middle of the desert. If anybody were to continue down that turnoff, they would eventually come across the famous Nevada National Security Site No Trespassing sign. The sign sits beside a small guardhouse, just a few thousand yards outside of Mercury. The town may appear to be in the middle of nowhere, but the road past this guardhouse is closely monitored. Any trespassing is noticed and swiftly dealt with. Beyond the guardhouse is the town of Mercury. How Mercury got its name is something of a mystery. Local folklore says it originated from a mercury mine in the nearby Calico Hills. Miners would travel through the area to the mine, with the road becoming known as Mercury Road, and eventually the area being known as Mercury. In 1951, the area became part of the newly formed Nevada test site. By this point, the Cold War was well underway, and the United States nuclear program was only growing. There had been a series of tests in the Pacific, but for security and financial reasons, authorities wanted to bring the testing to the continental US. The Nevada test site was chosen for a variety of reasons, including the geology, weather conditions, and the fact almost nobody lived in the area. The lack of a population did have one downside, though. There was nowhere for personnel to actually live. It would be possible for people to commute from places like Las Vegas, but the work that was happening at the Nevada test site was highly classified. Having hundreds of people going in and out of such a secure area every day wasn't the best way to keep things secure. Base Camp Mercury was set up for civilian and military personnel. Overcrowding soon became an issue, and millions of dollars were spent to improve facilities. By the mid-1960s, it was a bustling town of about 10,000 residents. Mercury had everything that could be found in any 1960s town, from a post office to dry cleaning to a chapel. There were also recreational facilities such as a movie theater, restaurants, a bowling alley, and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Mercury also had its own small airport, built for a visit by President Kennedy in 1963. Mercury was built away from where the main testing took place, which was supposed to mean it was safe. Between 1951 and 1992, over 1,000 nuclear tests took place at the Nevada test site, supported by workers at Mercury. 100 of those were above-ground tests, which took place in the earliest years of the program. The tests were then moved underground, though some still created craters on the surface. Many of the people taking part in the tests didn't realize at the time just how dangerous it would be. Military personnel would stand in bunkers with their heads and shoulders exposed to watch the mushroom clouds and the shock waves that would ripple out from the blast site. After tests, they would be brushed down to try to remove radioactive dust from their clothing, but that only had a limited effect. Decades later, studies found that veterans of the Nevada tests were 50% more likely to contract cancer than those who were not part of the tests. Many of the people that called Mercury home would be victims of the fallout. When the nuclear testing program came to an end, the number of personnel needed at the Nevada test site, or the Nevada National Security Site as it's known today, dwindled. Mercury became a ghost town and most of the facilities were shuttered. However, the Nevada National Security Site is still in use today. The site actually expanded even after the nuclear program ended, with more land being acquired as late as 1999. What exactly happens there today is as secretive as anything that takes place at a military facility. We do know that non-nuclear tests still take place, as well as training exercises for the event that an all-out nuclear war takes place. As such, the Nevada National Security Site remains heavily restricted, and that includes Mercury. Accessing Mercury isn't entirely impossible, though. As well as the 1,200 workers who visit daily, there is a tour run by the Department of Energy. It takes place once a month and must be booked well in advance. A bus takes visitors from the Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas out into the desert to Mercury. From there, the rest of the facility is toured. All cameras, phones, and Geiger counters must be left behind, as taking photos of the site is even more restricted than visiting. People going on the tour are vetted beforehand, for security reasons and to prevent any nuclear protesters from getting beyond the guardhouse. The people on the tour are shown many impressive and terrifying sights, including craters left over from old tests, and the creepy remains of fake towns designed to test how structures would be impacted by the blasts. Most of the site remains off limits though. The group stays with the guide and wandering off to explore is not allowed. This is partially due to security. It's still an active base and not everything that occurs there can be known to the public, but there are also safety concerns. It's not surprising that there are areas of the Nevada test site with high levels of radiation still in the soil and groundwater. Today, Mercury is little more than a ghost town. It's not quite as creepy as the fake towns that lie within the blast range, waiting to be destroyed for research purposes. But there is a different kind of creepiness to an area where people lived and worked for decades on highly classified and dangerous projects. The workers that sometimes stay in Mercury overnight are often working on preparations for a terrifying possible future that would forever change life as we know it. Number 3. It's easy to see how Plato's story of Atlantis captured the imaginations of ancient people, especially in the eastern Mediterranean. In ancient times, this was an area in a state of flux in many different ways. It was and remains tectonically active, with earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis all threatening to send settlements to the bottom of the ocean. Add to that the rising sea levels and it wouldn't have been entirely unheard of for a settlement to completely disappear. No area was perhaps more in flux than that of Lisha, on the coast of what is today Turkey. Lisha was a region of the United City-States in the mountainous area of Teke Peninsula. Sandwiched between the mountains and the ocean, it was the perfect place for culture to flourish without interference from the larger empires that surrounded it. The Lycians remain somewhat mysterious to us today, and not a whole lot is known about them. They had their own language and may have been mentioned in writing as far away as Egypt. The Greeks knew of them and believed they were the descendants of the people cast out of Crete by King Minos. In reality, they may have been native Anatolians, who simply made their home in this beautiful area, with some limited migrations from Crete. The settlements that would make up the Lycian Legion got started around the 5th century BCE. It was a federation that cherished its independence and fought for it hard. Persia was the first major empire to try to take over the region, and the Lycians fought hard. When the capital Xanthos was taken, the citizens decided to destroy the city rather than let it fall into Persian hands. Persia mostly led the Lycians to do as they wanted. Even if they were officially part of the empire, it was difficult to exert any control over the remote area. The area would then fall into Greek influence with the conquests of Alexander the Great, and eventually part of the Roman Empire under Augustus. Throughout the 5 centuries or so, Lycia had flourished. It was the perfect position to take advantage of traffic moving around the Mediterranean and grew very wealthy. That drew the attention of pirates, but for the most part, there didn't seem to be any major fights in the area. Of those small cities and towns, Cymena and Delichist were even more independent than the region of the Lycian League. Cymena lay on the coast, while Delichist was an island. Getting there was difficult by land, and the areas were mostly autonomous, even compared to the rest of the League. Not a whole lot is known about these 2 settlements. Cymena was one of the cities in the League that had a vote on important matters, but it only had 1. More important cities like Xanthos each had 3 votes. Delichist didn't get that much. We know that the Lycians had their own language. It wasn't properly deciphered until the 1970s. But unlike ancient Egypt, that didn't suddenly unlock centuries worth of writing to tell the story of Lycia. Instead, we have a few hundred transcripts, most of which seem to focus on Xanthos. That makes Cymena and Delichist even more mysterious. Like other cities in Lycia, the 2 locations have left behind countless stone tombs with inscriptions for modern archaeologists to puzzle over. The main problem with this is that a large part of this is underwater. In 141 CE, a devastating earthquake struck. Cymena and Delichist sit between 3 fault lines, making it even more tectonically active than the already active Mediterranean. The earthquake didn't just shake the buildings to the ground, it lowered the ground itself. Delichist was plunged entirely beneath the sea level, while parts of Cymena and other settlements in the surrounding areas were partially submerged. Archaeologists studying the area have found evidence that the people of Delichist relocated their settlement to the coast, but countless buildings, tombs, and artifacts were lost beneath the waves. The areas were rebuilt, but Lycia as a whole would only last until around the 8th century. The area wasn't just tectonically active, but politically active. After going from Persian to Greek to Roman hands, it had been part of the Byzantine Empire until Arab conquest shrank the Byzantine holdings. After it fell out of the Byzantine Empire, the Lycians seemingly abandoned their settlements, only to be repopulated by the Ottomans in the 1200s. Today, what remains of Cymena is one of the most popular areas in what was once Lycia. The area attracts countless tourists each year, attracted by the beautiful beaches and clear turquoise waters. However, exploring the ruins is restricted. In many areas, anchoring boats is not allowed. Some of the sunken cities, such as Cymena, may allow tourists to snorkel and get a close-up at the Atlantis-like world, but snorkeling at Delichist is strictly forbidden. Efforts are being made to preserve the area, which has ambitions of becoming a World Heritage Site. It's possible that something beneath the sea might unlock the mystery of Lycia, or at least this part of the ancient country. And historians and archaeologists are keen to not let over-tourism destroy that possibility. For now, tourists will have to stick to some of the other sunken areas, or the amazing sites on land, as they try to imagine what it could have been like to live in the area 2,000 years ago. Number 2. Deep beneath the streets of Paris lies a network of tunnels and caverns, hidden behind secret entrances and off-limits to the general public. The Paris Catacombs is possibly the most intriguing and creepiest forbidden location on Earth. Today, only a tiny fraction of the 300 kilometers of tunnels are open to the public, but that hasn't stopped hundreds of people from accessing the forbidden locations. The tunnels that make up the Paris Catacombs existed centuries before anybody thought to house the remains of past Parisians inside them. They date back to at least the 1200s, though some sources claim digging began in Roman times. They weren't designed for burials or anything macabre, instead they were quarries. Stone was mined from beneath the areas surrounding Paris and was used to build some of the most impressive buildings seen in the city today. The mines were originally outside the city of Paris, but as the City of Lights grew, it came to encompass land above the tunnels. By the 1700s, most of these tunnels were abandoned. The mining had ended and most of the tunnels were in a state of disrepair. Sometimes that led to sinkholes opening up on the surface, swallowing entire houses. At the same time, Paris had a problem with its cemeteries. Being such an old city, the remains of many centuries worth of Parisians were entombed in various cemeteries. Some, such as the Holy Innocents Cemetery, were struggling to contain all the remains, and there simply wasn't anywhere for those who recently passed to be buried. Eventually, the problem became too big to ignore. Authorities decided to fix two problems at once. The tunnels beneath the streets of Paris would be strengthened, and would then become the final resting place of millions of people who had once been in these now overflowing cemeteries. Work to create the ossuaries began in 1786 and wouldn't be completed until 1860. However, even with the remains of millions of people now stored in the tunnels, only a small fraction of the former mines were used for this morbid purpose. The rest of the tunnels looked like any other abandoned mine, with bare stone walls, uneven surfaces, and pools of clear water that didn't seem to have a bottom. Other areas were used for the growing of mushrooms, as well as storing wine and other goods. Even before the catacombs were finished, they were open to the public. That first came in the form of an appointment-only tour, before being opened up more. They would remain open until the 1950s. During that time, the catacombs witnessed as much of Paris's history as the streets above. They became hiding places for the French resistance during the Second World War, as well as bunkers for the German army. What happened above had an impact on what happened below. In 1955, the majority of the catacombs were closed off to the general public. Only a few miles is open today. For most, this small insight into the hidden world beneath Paris is enough. It's where the most impressive bone collections are housed. It's relatively well lit, with signposts that make sure visitors don't get lost, but is creepy enough to satisfy most interested in the macabre. But others want to see more and explore beyond the legal limits. Today, there's a community of a few hundred people called cataphiles that navigate the pitch-black tunnels. People are attracted to the underground labyrinth for a number of reasons. For some, it's a place to escape their ordinary life. Names, jobs, and schools from the surface world aren't shared. This is a place where they can be someone else without the stresses of the surface. Others simply want to explore and carefully map out the tunnels, many of which are completely forgotten about. For the most part, the community is self-governing. Cataphiles respect the catacombs and want to look after and protect the ancient tunnels. For that reason, graffiti is mostly frowned upon, though there are other art installations such as statues of gargoyles in buildings. The rule of what goes down must come up limits littering. The respect for the tunnels is one of the reasons why many cataphiles will often be unwelcoming to tourists and non-cataphiles. The more people that visit these illegal areas, the more likely the entrances will be sealed and the catacombs will be ruined for all. Visiting the catacombs, especially without the guidance of someone who knows what they're doing in the creepy tunnels, is incredibly dangerous. Being caught in the illegal spaces leads to an on-the-spot fine, but that's far from the worst thing that could happen. There are many stories about people getting lost in the catacombs, never to resurface. The tunnels are hard to navigate without a guide. Some areas have plaques indicating what's directly above, but sometimes these are changed to deliberately mislead people. For the most part, stories of people getting lost never to resurface are just stories, with little evidence to back them up. But there is one time that did happen. In 1793, a watchman at a hospital wandered into the catacombs while searching for a bottle of alcohol. He was found 11 years later, not far from an exit, with the bottle in his hands. He was buried at the location where he passed away. More recently, people have been rescued after days beneath the surface, suffering from hypothermia after being in the cool temperatures for so long. Getting lost isn't the only danger in the catacombs. Even getting to the tunnels can be tricky. The tunnels can be accessed by sewer grates, entrances in metro tunnels, and other hidden entrances known only to a few. Knowing only one entrance to the catacombs isn't a good way to start exploring, though. Paris police keep an eye on any potential routes to the underground world. Once one is found, it may be sealed off. If someone were to go exploring, it's always a good idea to have alternative exits in mind to make sure you don't get trapped beneath the surface. Once inside, there are miles and miles of tunnels to explore. Some are barely navigable with low ceilings, thigh-high water, and extremely narrow. Others open up into spaces large enough to hold a cinema or an illegal party. Police on one occasion found a cinema space, a lounge, and a bar area, all hooked up with illegal electrical lines. When they returned a few days later to do a more thorough investigation, they found the entire area empty, with a note warning the officers not to go looking for the owners. Cave-ins are less common than might be expected for an ancient tunnel system, but they do sometimes happen. The vibrations of nearby metro trains don't help this. The uneven surface can lead to trips and falls or knocks to the head. A rescue mission would be extremely difficult. If an explorer were to get injured while alone, their best chance of getting help might just be to hope that they haven't wandered too far from the well-trodden routes. Despite the dangers and risks of a find, people continue to be drawn to the hidden subterranean world. It isn't recommended, and with the wealth of virtual tours online, there are safer ways to explore this forbidden location. Number 1. Nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia lies Mount Weather, a relatively ordinary mountain with a creepy secret. The Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center is the place where the US government will continue, even if the US itself doesn't. Mount Weather sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, and it's unsurprising that it's featured in countless works of fiction. Very little is known about the base, buried deep in the mountains, and for good reason. In the case of an emergency, it's here that the top government officials will be flown to. Mount Weather was formed some 480 million years ago with the rest of the Appalachian Mountains. It's made up of epidote and greenstone, an extremely dense rock with few fissures or faults. In the 1800s, it was seen as the perfect location for researching the weather. It was here that various weather balloons and kites were released. Over time, the station on top of Mount Weather changed hands. By the 1950s, it was in the hands of the US Bureau of Mines, which had been using experimental technology to dig into the mountainsides. These original shafts would later become the starting point for the secret base. After the Soviet Union launched its first atomic weapon, the US government decided it needed bases that could sustain a nuclear attack. In the case of an emergency, top government officials, the Supreme Court, and the top military staff would all need to be somewhere safe to carry out their duties. This continuity of government was designed to keep the United States running no matter what. A number of locations were selected, including Mount Weather. Mount Weather is only 48 miles from Washington, D.C. by air, and testing during the mining operation showed it could sustain heavy blasts. The mine shafts were expanded to create the most high-tech bunker possible. Nobody who's ever been in the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center has described what was there, but some details have emerged through various declassified reports. By some accounts, it seems like a small town was built into the mountain, equipped to sustain hundreds or even thousands of people. As well as sleeping quarters and various offices, the bunker is equipped with drinking and cooling water, a power station, a hospital, recreation centers, and dining areas. There's also a radio and television studio. The site is home to the control station for the Federal Emergency Management Agency's national radio system, which connects most federal public safety agencies in the US military. Through this system, the occupants of the bunker would be able to access the emergency alert system. All of this is buried deep underground. Above ground, there are areas for various training exercises, as well as a helipad, and a long chain-link fence to keep out trespassers. People living in the nearby area have known about the Emergency Operations Center throughout its existence. It's a source of work for many residents. The small towns were never closed cities, but they took the security of Mount Weather seriously. Even today, few people in the local area are willing to talk to outsiders about it. With most of the facilities being underground, the area above Mount Weather isn't restricted airspace, which is what eventually drew public attention to the mysterious base in 1979. By this point, the base had been used multiple times. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, top aides were sent to the base to prepare it in case of an emergency evacuation. Drills had been conducted, but it managed to stay out of the public eye. That changed on the morning of December 1st, 1979. Weather conditions that morning were terrible. The flights were being redirected from Washington National Airport. One such flight was the TWA Flight 514. It had been en route to the airport from Columbus, Ohio, but it was now being redirected to Dulles, roughly 25 miles from Mount Weather. Due to confusion between the pilot and air traffic control and heavy snow, The plane hit Mount Weather less than 1.5 miles away from the base. It cost the lives of everybody on board. Reporters and news cameramen were not allowed near the site to report on the incident. In the aftermath, the Washington Post mentioned the secret government base in one of the reports on the incident. It was only a brief mention, but it caught people's attention. The facilities at the Emergency Operations Center were mostly undisturbed by the incident. The only issue was a severed line that connected to the emergency broadcast system, but that was back online in a few hours. Despite the unwanted attention, the news report didn't lead to a swarm of activity around Mount Weather. There weren't people trying to get a glimpse of the secret government base from outside. Operations continued as normal. The National Gallery of Art came up with a program to transport valuable pieces of art to the secure location in case of an emergency, and preparedness drills continued. It did begin to feature in novels and TV shows more. Mount Weather's first appearance in fiction actually came before the 1979 incident, in a 1962 book called 7 Days in May. In that book, the facility is called Mount Thunder, though anybody who knew about Mount Weather would know what the facility was based upon. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center is still manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. New threats meant that the base remained a necessity. Renovations continued to take place to keep it state-of-the-art. It was actually used as recently as 2015. On April 7th, there was a power outage in Washington, D.C., which forced government buildings to use backup generators. The outage was the result of something mundane, a transmission line in Maryland causing a dip in voltage. But the Office of Operations Coordination wasted no time. The National Operations Center was briefly moved to Mount Weather before the incident was resolved. Mount Weather is a strange place when it comes to secrecy. For example, in 2001, it was featured in a documentary called Bunkers, where experts talked about the facility and gave the public some of the few insights into how it works and what exists under the mountain. However, in a 2006 report by the UK's Guardian, a national security researcher pointed out black sheeting threaded through the chain link fence to stop anybody from looking through. There are warning signs telling people not to sketch the facility, even though the site has been filmed from the air and broadcast on national TV at one point. Even though the facility sits in a strange balance of top secret and free to look at, one thing remains the same. Going past the gates at the end of Route 601 is impossible without top security clearance. The people who work at Mount Weather remain tight-lipped about their role and what goes on there, and it's likely that the only time the general public will ever get to see the inside of the base will be if the president ever has to film an emergency address from beneath the mountain. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.